The airplane wheels touched the runway with a soft thud, and I felt that familiar mix of relief and worry that always comes when you are traveling to family. My purse buzzed with missed calls from neighbors back home, but there was nothing from my son. He knew I was coming. Welcome to my channel. If you're watching this on Facebook, don't forget to follow the page. And if you're watching on YouTube, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you enjoyed the story, let me know in the comments below. You can also share your thoughts from the heart in the comments, so I can create more stories based on what you love. Thank you for your support. He knew I hadn't seen him in months. I convinced myself he was busy at work, or maybe planning a surprise, and I pushed the unease down as I wheeled my suitcase through the airport doors and toward the rideshare line. The winter air bit at my cheeks, and the city smelled like damp concrete and coffee. I told the driver to take me straight to the hospital, because that was the one thing I knew for certain. My daughter-in-law was there, fighting for her life. The nurse at the front desk spoke in that gentle, professional tone that makes you brace for impact. She checked the chart, looked at me over her glasses, and led me down a long hallway lit by buzzing fluorescent lights. Every step echoed. Machines hummed behind closed doors. My heart pounded like it wanted out of my chest. When we stopped, she didn't say much, just opened the door to the ICU room and held it for me. That silence was louder than any siren. There she was, small and pale against the white sheets, wires tracing paths over her arms like thin, electric vines. The monitors glowed in the dim light, tracking every fragile breath. A single plastic chair set near the bed, empty. No flowers. No crumpled coffee cups. No jacket thrown over the back to say, someone has been here, loving her. I took that seat and wrapped my hands around hers, trying to warm her skin with my palms, whispering her name as if I could call her back with simple sound. I waited for my son to walk in any minute, cheeks flushed from running down the hall, excuses tumbling out, but grateful that someone had been here. Minutes turned into an hour. The nurse returned to check the 4, glanced at me, then away, like she didn't want to speak the question on both our minds. Where was he? I swallowed my anger like a bitter pill and told myself not to jump to conclusions. Maybe there had been an emergency. Maybe his phone had died. Maybe anything other than the worst thought knocking on my skull. When I finally stepped out to call him, the phone rang and rang, then clicked to voicemail. I tried again. And again. On the 4th try, someone answered in a burst of laughter and loud music. Not my son's voice, but a girl's, breathless and carefree. She shouted his name, and I heard his laugh in the background, the same laugh he had as a little boy when he rode his first bike. Except now it cut through me like glass. I hung up without a word and stood there in the hallway, my hand shaking, the sterile smell of disinfectant suddenly sickening. I had given him that car when he promised he would take care of his wife, when he swore he was ready to be a man. I remembered the look in his eyes when I pressed the keys into his palm. Pride. Gratitude. Illusions, maybe. Now those keys were taking him everywhere except where he was needed most. I felt something inside me harden, not out of hatred, but out of a fierce, protective love for the woman lying alone in that room. By the time I reached the hospital's front entrance, the sky had turned a bruised purple, streetlights flickering on one by one. I stood there on the cold pavement, the phone heavy in my hand, and made a decision that changed everything. If he would not respect his responsibilities, then I would remove the toys that let him run from them. My voice barely trembled when I called the authorities and explained that the vehicle I had purchased was no longer in safe or rightful use. It felt like closing a door I had held open for too long. That night, I returned to the ICU and sat beside my daughter-in-law again, listening to the machines, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest. I thought about the little family we were supposed to be, the dinners, the holidays, the ordinary days that never came. I promised her, out loud, that she would never be alone again, not while I still had breath in my body. And somewhere out there, my son laughed in the dark without knowing the storm that was already on its way toward him, carried by the same woman who once tucked him into bed and kissed his forehead goodnight. The next morning began before the sun, when the nurses changed shifts and the halls filled with the soft shuffle of rubber soles. I had slept upright in the chair, my coat over my shoulders, my fingers still laced with hers as if letting go might invite the darkness closer. A doctor with tired eyes explained the machines in careful sentences, speaking about oxygen levels and infection and chances that sounded more like prayers than math. I nodded, because what else can a person do when their world is measured in blinking lights and steady beeps? I brushed her hair away from her forehead and told her stories she couldn't answer, about the first time I met her, about the way she laughed when my son did something foolish, about the tiny hopes we never said out loud. Late that afternoon, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was polite but official, asking me to confirm my report. The car had been located. There had been no accident, only recklessness and noise, and the kind of arrogance that makes people forget the consequences that wait for them. My heart twisted because he was still my child, even when he behaved like a stranger. I gave the answers they needed and hung up, staring out the window at the gray sky layered over the city like a wet blanket. I wondered when he would realize that the world wasn't built to revolve around his whims, that people break, that promises matter. In the evening, a social worker sat with me in the family lounge. Her voice was gentle, but she did not hide the gravity of the situation. She asked who else could be called. I said his name, and the words tasted like disappointment. She took the number, tried it, and received the same careless voicemail I had heard. The message beeped, and her trained voice left a simple note, a request for him to come to the hospital because his wife needed him. I closed my eyes and listened to the echo of that sentence inside my chest. His wife needs him. His wife needs him. It should have been the only truth that mattered. Hours passed. Nurses came and went. I learned the rhythm of the machines and the tilt of her head when the pillow had slipped. I held a straw to her lips when they moistened them, even though she didn't wake. I whispered gratitude to the staff and then silently scolded my own son with every breath. I remembered the boy who once cried when his goldfish died, the teenager who sulked but still mowed the lawn when I asked, the young man who assured me that love had made him better, steadier, wiser. Somewhere along the line, that promise had been misplaced like a receipt at the bottom of a drawer. That night, the phone finally rang again. Not a giggle or a song or a careless hello, but a flat voice from a holding facility asking if I would accept the charges. My stomach dropped, and for a long second I couldn't move. Then I said yes, because I always say yes, even when I shouldn't. His voice came through, thinner than I remembered, edged with panic. He didn't ask about his wife. He asked about the car. I stood there in the corridor with my hand pressed to the cold glass of the window and told him that the car didn't matter anymore, that he needed to think about the vows he had made, about the woman who had carried his name and now carried machines in her place. There was silence, then a scoff, then a clumsy attempt to shift the blame onto everyone but himself. I ended the call with a trembling goodbye and walked back to her bedside, where the truth was too loud to ignore. 2 days blurred together, marked only by the rising and falling graph on the monitor and the bitter coffee from the vending machine. The nurses began to greet me by name. One of them tucked a blanket around my shoulders when I started to shiver. Another slipped a tiny paper cup of water into my hand like a gift. Kindness can ache as much as cruelty when you feel you don't deserve it. I thought of all the times I had defended my son, excused him, shielded him from the weight of his own choices. Standing there in that sterile room, I understood that love isn't always softness. Sometimes it is a boundary drawn in quiet, unshakable ink. When he was finally released, I didn't tell him where I was. I stayed in the chair, listening to the whisper of the oxygen, waiting for the moment the door would open and he would appear, unsure and frightened, ready at last to see the consequences of his neglect. The hours stretched like wire, each one pulling a little tighter around my heart. I rehearsed the words I would say, not as a weapon, but as a truth I should have spoken long ago. I would tell him that responsibility is not a punishment. It is the price of being trusted, the cost of being loved. I would tell him that the next step he took could either repair or ruin what little remained. Night settled over the city again, and the moonlight spilled across the hospital floor like spilled milk. I squeezed her hand and promised her that she was not invisible, that someone saw her, that someone would fight for her even if it meant standing against her own flesh and blood. Somewhere beyond those walls, my son was moving through the dark toward me, carrying a lifetime of choices he could no longer outrun. He arrived just before dawn, when the sky was the color of wet ash and the streets were still half asleep. I heard his footsteps in the hallway before I saw his face, that familiar uneven rhythm I had known since he first learned to walk. When he stepped into the room, the bravado that usually clung to him like cheap cologne was gone. He looked smaller, as if the night itself had pressed down on his shoulders. His eyes darted to the machines, to the wires, to the pale stillness of the woman he had promised to cherish, and I watched the reality of it all crash into him with brutal honesty. For a moment, he didn't speak. He just stood there, breathing like he had run miles, even though he hadn't moved at all. Then the apologies began. Not the quick, empty ones tossed over his shoulder when he was late for dinner, but slow, broken words that cracked in the middle and fell apart before they reached me. He said he hadn't understood how serious things were. He said he'd meant to come. He said 1,000 things that all circled around the same truth. He had chosen himself over her again and again, until the choice became so easy he no longer recognized it as a choice at all. His legs buckled, and he dropped to the floor at my feet, pressing his forehead to the tile like a man begging for rain in the desert. I had seen him stubborn, angry, careless. I had never seen him stripped of excuses. I didn't rush to lift him. I let the silence fill the room, a heavy, aching silence that asked harder questions than I ever could. I told him to look at her, to really look. Not as a burden or an obligation, but as the woman who had stood beside him when the world was loud and bright, who had believed his promises even when I no longer did. He crawled forward, gripping the edge of the bed like it was the only solid thing left in the world, and whispered her name with a reverence I wished had come sooner. His tears darkened the blanket, small circles of salt and regret. The nurses came and went, kind enough to pretend they didn't see the wreckage of a family trying to put itself back together on the ICU floor. I told him about the phone calls, about the laughter in the background, about the empty chair that had sat beside her for days. Each word landed like a stone in water, sending slow ripples through his expression. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He just listened, and for the first time in years, I believed he actually heard me. As the hours passed, he stayed at her side, holding her hand with a careful tenderness, as if he were afraid she might shatter. He spoke to her in a soft voice I barely recognized, recounting the ordinary details of their life together, burnt toast, late-night drives, dumb jokes, threads of memory woven into a plea she might never answer. I watched him, my heart torn between aching for the boy he once was and mourning the man he had become. Regret is a delayed teacher, but its lessons last a lifetime. When we stepped out into the hallway for a moment, he asked about the car, about the report, about everything that had spiraled out from that single decision I had made. I told him calmly that I would not apologize for forcing a pause he had refused to take on his own. That sometimes the only way to save a person is to dismantle the excuses they hide behind. He nodded slowly, eyes red, accepting a truth he had run from since he was old enough to choose differently. Later, as night folded itself around the hospital once more, he leaned his head against my shoulder like he used to when storms rattled the windows of our old house. He whispered that he was afraid of losing her, afraid of living with the memory of who he had been. I didn't promise him it would be okay. I told him only that change begins the moment you stop lying to yourself, and that real love demands showing up even when it hurts. We sat there in the dim light, two people finally facing the wreckage together, while a fragile hope flickered between the sound of machines and the soft rhythm of her breathing. Morning spilled like pale gold through the narrow window, and for the first time since I had arrived, the room didn't feel entirely swallowed by fear. My son didn't leave her side. He rose when the nurses needed space, sat when they finished, and listened with solemn focus to every update the doctors offered. The arrogance that once cloaked him had fallen away, leaving a quiet man who seemed startled by the damage his absence had carved into the people he claimed to love. He pressed his forehead to the back of her hand and promised that if she opened her eyes, he would never again let her face a storm alone. I watched him, not with anger, but with the cautious hope that maybe the breaking of his pride had made space for something better to grow. The doctors spoke of small changes, percentages, possibilities that drifted like fragile clouds. None of it was certain. None of it was hopeless either. I began to realize that life isn't often made of clean edges. It is stitched together from messy compromises and the quiet bravery of showing up again after failing. In the hushed glow of machines, I remembered the boy who used to hide behind my skirt when strangers spoke to him, and the teenager who swore he didn't need anyone. Now he understood, in the hardest way, that needing others doesn't make a person weak. Ignoring that need does. We took turns resting in the narrow chair, our conversations low and careful. He confessed things he had buried, fears he never voiced, doubts he never shared with her because he thought he needed to look unshakable. I told him that strength has nothing to do with pretending and everything to do with tenderness. The truth seemed to soften him. He asked how he could fix what he had broken, and I told him he could not rewrite the past, but he could choose every step from here forward with deliberate care. Change is a choice we make again each morning, not a single grand gesture that absolves the rest. One afternoon, a small movement fluttered through her fingers, like a whisper under the skin. It was tiny, almost imperceptible, but it sent a shock of relief through the room. My son gasped her name, startled by how much hope could fit inside one fragile motion. The nurse smiled gently and encouraged patience. Healing, she said, is a slow story. Sometimes the chapters are only a single breath long. We listened to the steady rhythm of the monitor and let the moment expand inside us like light through a crack in the door. In the days that followed, my son began to rebuild in quiet ways. He called his employer himself. He apologized to neighbors he had ignored. He sent messages to the people who had once fueled his carelessness, refusing the invitations that once tempted him. No dramatic speeches, no grand performances, just the steady, humble work of becoming a man who shows up. And every evening, he sat beside her, speaking softly, filling the room with the sound of his newfound honesty. The nurses started to smile when they passed, as if they too could see something shifting. I thought often about the phone call I had made, the one that set the wheels of consequence in motion. For a while, guilt tried to creep in, whispering that I had gone too far. But then I would look at him, this quieter, brighter version of my child, and I knew that sometimes love is not a shelter but a sharp wake-up call. It doesn't always sound like comfort. Sometimes it sounds like the ground giving way so that roots can grow deeper afterward. One evening, as the sky darkened into indigo and the city lights blinked awake, my son turned to me with eyes that finally looked clear. He thanked me not for the car, not for the countless rescues, but for refusing to let him sink into the illusion that there would always be more time to change. He said he now understood that every day is a fragile loan, and the people we love are not guarantees. They are gifts, and gifts must be cherished while they are still warm in our hands. I reached for his shoulder, feeling the quiet strength in the way he held himself. He was still afraid, still uncertain of what the next sunrise would bring, but for the first time I believed he would meet it with courage instead of excuses. We turned back to her together, two hearts humbled, waiting for the smallest sign that she could feel how fiercely she was loved. And in that waiting, we found something we had both been missing for years, a sense of family that wasn't built on promises alone, but on presence, on truth, on the simple act of staying when it would be easier to run. The next morning arrived wrapped in a hush, as if the world itself was holding its breath. A soft mist clung to the hospital windows, blurring the city into watercolor. My son and I sat in the same careful silence, hands wrapped around lukewarm coffee, while the monitors kept their steady vigil. There was a stillness inside me I hadn't felt in years, the kind that comes when you finally accept that you can't bargain with fate, you can only meet it with whatever courage you have left. A new doctor came in with a team, their voices low but purposeful. They spoke of improvements so small they could barely be measured, but real nonetheless. A better response to treatment. A steadier pattern. A body that, against every doubt, still seemed to be reaching back toward life. My son closed his eyes and let the words wash over him like fragile sunlight. He didn't celebrate out loud. He just took her hand in both of his and held it as though he had finally learned how much something can matter. When the room cleared, he turned to me with a vulnerability that made him look almost like the child he used to be. He asked if I believed in second chances, not the kind people toss around when they want forgiveness without change, but the kind that are earned inch by inch, through apology and effort and the long work of showing up every day. I told him that second chances are real, but they always come with responsibility. They aren't a gift. They are an agreement. To do better, to be better, to never again forget what matters most. Over the next few days, he honored that agreement. He spoke less and listened more. He stopped searching for escape routes in every conversation and instead sat with the discomfort of his regret. He apologized to her family in quiet, sincere words that didn't try to shrink his mistakes. He called the social worker back, asking for resources, counseling, ways to learn how to rebuild safely. His pride, once so loud, had finally learned to be humble. And in that humility, I began to see the first outlines of the man he might still become. There were difficult moments too. Nights when the fear came back like a tide and he paced the hallway, hands pressed to his face, whispering that he didn't deserve forgiveness. I stood with him then, side by side, and reminded him that guilt can paralyze or it can guide. It depends on what you choose to do next. We cannot change yesterday, but we can honor it by choosing wisely today. He nodded, swallowing hard, and each time he returned to her bedside, steadier than before. One afternoon, as the winter light slanted across the floor in pale ribbons, the faintest flutter crossed her eyelids. It was so delicate that at first we doubted it. But then it came again, and the doctor confirmed it with a hopeful smile. Not awake, not yet, but closer. My son's shoulders crumpled with relief. He laid his head gently on the blanket and let silent tears fall, not of panic this time, but of gratitude for a chance he knew he might not have earned, but would fight every day to deserve. From that moment forward, he treated every heartbeat, every breath, like a sacred promise. He helped the nurses reposition her. He read aloud from her favorite books. He played the songs they used to sing on long drives, his voice unsteady but determined. And when exhaustion finally claimed him, he slept in the chair with his hand still wrapped around hers, as if letting go even in sleep felt like too great a risk. There were times I stepped out of the room and watched through the small pane of glass in the door, watched my son sitting in the quiet, not fleeing, not hiding, simply staying. It struck me then how fragile and powerful presence can be. Love isn't always grand gestures and flawless timing. Sometimes it is simply refusing to vanish when things become heavy. One evening, as rain tapped softly against the windows, he turned to me and said that if she awakened, he would start over with her, not from the beginning, but from the truth. No more secrets. No more pretending. No more putting distraction before devotion. I believed him, not because the words were beautiful, but because they were calm, grounded, and without performance. I also knew that whatever happened, whether she opened her eyes tomorrow, months from now, or not at all, he had crossed an invisible threshold. The boy who once treated life like an endless runway of chances had finally reached the edge and had chosen, with trembling honesty, to change. Late that night, while the wind sighed against the building, I placed my hand over both of theirs. For the first time in a long while, I felt a quiet peace. I didn't know what the ending of this story would be, but I knew we would meet it together, without running, without denial, with whatever strength love could lend us. And as the machines kept time with the rhythm of hope, the three of us, one awake, one healing, and one learning how to become, waited for the dawn to bring whatever tomorrow had the courage to offer. Dawn finally arrived, soft and quiet, like a guest who didn't want to disturb the house. A pale stripe of light crept across the linoleum floor and climbed slowly toward the bed. My son stirred in the chair, blinking himself awake, his fingers still threaded through hers. He looked different in the morning light, older, steadier, like the night had carved something true into him that could not be easily erased. I poured us both weak coffee from the family lounge, and we drank it in silence, grateful for the simple fact that we were still here. Then it happened. Not the dramatic kind of awakening you see in movies, no sudden gasp, no sharp cry, just a small, searching movement of her lips and the faintest tightening of her fingers around his. He froze. I watched his eyes widen, hope blooming there like sunrise breaking open after a storm. He leaned forward, whispering her name with a reverence I had only ever heard in church pews and hospital rooms. Her eyelids fluttered like wings trying to remember how to fly. A nurse stepped in, eyes bright, gentle but alert, encouraging calm while she checked every line and monitor with careful hands. Minutes stretched. Breath by breath, she surfaced from whatever deep, dark ocean she'd been drifting in. When her eyes finally opened, they were unfocused at first, then slowly began to search the room. She looked at the ceiling, then the window, then at last at him. Recognition moved across her face like light through clouds. Not a smile yet, but something close, something fragile and priceless. He didn't speak right away. He just cried quietly, helplessly, bowing his head to her hand as though he were thanking it for simply existing. When he did finally manage words, they came out in a hoarse whisper. He told her he was there, that he wasn't going anywhere, that he was sorry in a way that was more than sound. She watched him with tired, questioning eyes, and though she couldn't say much, the way her fingers curled around his told me. She heard him. Recovery was not a straight line. Some days she seemed stronger, her voice a little clearer, her gaze more anchored. Other days were heavy and slow, filled with long silences and the low hum of machines. But my son never drifted again. He spoke with doctors. He learned how to help without getting in the way. He walked her through each milestone with patience I had once believed him incapable of. When she stood for the first time with help, his hands trembled like he was steadying a newborn. Gratitude became the language of his days. Eventually, the ICU gave way to a quieter room. Flowers appeared. Cards gathered on the windowsill, little paper boats of hope sent by friends and family. In the muted afternoons, sunlight spilled across the blankets, and they would sit together, sharing the kind of conversations that grow only from nearly losing everything. Honest ones. Raw ones. Sometimes painful. Always real. She asked him, gently but directly, about the days he had been gone. He didn't hide. He didn't twist the truth into something smaller. He owned it. And in return, she told him what it had felt like to be alone in that cold room, how silence can feel heavier than any illness. They built a bridge between them out of those confessions. Not perfect, not polished, but strong. I watched all of this from the doorway sometimes, unseen, my heart full in a way that was hard to name. Pride, yes. Relief, yes. But also the quiet knowledge that this was what love was meant to look like, not flawless people getting everything right, but flawed people choosing each other again, even after the truth has stripped them bare. When the day finally came for her to leave the hospital, winter had softened its edge. The air outside still carried a bite, but there was promise in it too. My son walked beside her, matching his steps to hers, one hand steady at her back, not guiding, just supporting. Before they left, he turned to me and wrapped me in a hug that didn't ask for anything and didn't hide anything. He thanked me again, not for the car, not for the rescues of the past, but for the boundary that had forced him to face the man in the mirror. Life didn't magically fix itself after that. There were doctor visits, therapy sessions, difficult conversations, and long evenings where fear sat quietly with us like a fourth family member. But there was also laughter in the kitchen again, music playing softly in the living room, the gentle rhythm of ordinary days returning like tide to shore. And through it all, my son kept his promise. He showed up. He stayed. He chose the hard, necessary work of being present. As for me, I learned something too. I learned that loving your child sometimes means stepping back from saving them so they can learn how to save themselves. I learned that consequences, when delivered with love, can be a strange kind of mercy. And I learned that even the most fractured relationships can be mended, thread by trembling thread, if both hearts are willing. One evening, much later, we sat together on their small porch, wrapped in blankets as the sun dipped below the horizon. She leaned against him, and he rested his cheek on her hair. The world felt quieter. Kinder. Not because it had changed, but because we had. He looked at me, gratitude in his eyes, and I realized that the long, painful journey had given us something we never had before, a deeper, truer kind of family. We didn't need grand speeches or perfect endings. We had the simple miracle of another day together, a gift I would never again take lightly. And as the first star appeared in the darkening sky, I whispered a silent thank you for the grace that had carried us through the storm and set us down gently on the other side.